The moment the doors opened and I saw my husband walk in holding another woman's hand as if I had never existed, the air inside the ballroom shifted in a way that only someone being erased in real time could understand. And before I tell you what happened next, I need you to do something for me, like this video, subscribe if you believe silence is not weakness, and tell me in the comments what you would do if the person you trusted most replaced you in front of the world. Because my name is Amara Cade, and the night my husband humiliated me was the same night he unknowingly challenged a power he could never defeat. The ballroom was drowning in gold light, chandeliers hanging like frozen stars above a sea of wealth, laughter echoing between glasses of champagne and polished marble floors. But none of it felt real to me anymore. Not when I stood there watching the man I had built my life around walk past me without even the slightest hesitation, his fingers intertwined with hers. A woman I had seen before in fragments, in late-night messages, in unexplained absences, in the silence that had slowly replaced our conversations over time. She walked beside him with confidence that didn't belong to her, her posture straight, her smile sharp, her eyes scanning the room as if she had already claimed it, and maybe in her mind she had. Because no one had told her the truth, no one had explained that she was stepping into a role that was never hers to take. But I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe properly as the whispers began to rise around me like smoke. Subtle at first, then spreading, guests leaning closer to one another, exchanging looks that carried more judgment than curiosity, because high society doesn't need confirmation to create a narrative. It builds one instantly, and in that moment the narrative was simple. I was being replaced. Darius didn't look at me immediately. Not when he reached the center of the room. Not when the music faded and attention shifted toward him. Not even when someone handed him a glass, and he raised it slightly as if preparing to speak, because ignoring me was part of the performance, part of the humiliation, part of the message he wanted to send without saying it directly. And when he finally did turn his head in my direction, the look in his eyes was not guilt, not hesitation, but something colder, something detached, as if I had already been removed from his world long before this moment. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low but clear enough to cut through the silence that had begun to form. And for a second I thought I had misunderstood him. Thought maybe this was some twisted misunderstanding that would resolve itself if I just asked the right question. So I stepped forward slightly, ignoring the way the room seemed to tighten around me, and I told him quietly that I was his wife, that I had every right to be there. And the way he laughed, the way his lips curved into something that resembled amusement more than cruelty, was worse than anything he could have said, because it meant he didn't even see me as a threat, didn't see me as someone worth respecting enough to hurt properly. "No," he replied, pulling the woman beside him closer in a gesture that felt deliberate, calculated, final. "She is." And the impact of those two words was immediate, not because they were loud, but because they were definitive. They erased years in a single breath, reduced everything we had been to. Something temporary, something replaceable, something insignificant. And around us, the reaction came in waves, gasps that were quickly covered by polite expressions, whispers that carried just enough volume to ensure I could hear them, phones lifting slightly as people prepared to capture what they already knew would become a story, a scandal, something they could retell later with excitement disguised as concern. I could feel my hands trembling, feel the weight of every eye in that room pressing against me, waiting for something, a reaction, a breakdown, a scene, because that is what people expect when someone is publicly destroyed. They expect emotion, they expect noise, they expect weakness, but I gave them none of that, not because I wasn't breaking, but because I understood something they didn't, something Darius had forgotten, something that would change everything before the night was over. The woman beside him tilted her head slightly, her gaze moving over me with a kind of curiosity that bordered on amusement, as if she was trying to understand how I had ever been in a position she now occupied. And when she spoke, her voice carried that smooth, controlled confidence of someone who believes they have already won, asking if I was going to cause a scene, or if I would leave with whatever dignity I had left. And for a moment, just a moment, I considered walking away, considered giving them exactly what they wanted, a quiet exit, a clean ending, a story that positioned them as the future and me as the past. But something inside me refused to move, refused to accept that narrative, refused to let this moment define me in a way that wasn't true. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, Not because I needed an answer, but because I wanted to hear him say it, wanted to hear the truth in his own voice, and he didn't hesitate, didn't soften, didn't even pretend to care about how his words would land as he leaned slightly closer and told me that I was never enough, that I had never been enough, that everything I thought we had built together existed only because he allowed it to, and those words, more than anything else, revealed exactly who he had become, someone who believed his own version of reality so completely that he could not see beyond it, someone who mistook visibility for power, someone who had forgotten that not all strength needs to be seen to exist. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before it, because now there was no confusion, no uncertainty, no possibility of misunderstanding. This was deliberate, intentional, final. And when he signaled toward the security at the edge of the room, instructing them with a simple gesture to remove me, the message became undeniable. I was not just being replaced, I was being erased. And as the guards began to move toward me, as the crowd leaned in just slightly to witness what they believed would be the end of my presence in that room, I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not even pain, but clarity, a calm, precise understanding that this moment, this exact moment, would be the last time anyone in that room underestimated me. Because what Darius had just done was not just a betrayal, it was a miscalculation, and before the night was over, he would understand exactly how costly that mistake truly was. The moment the security guards took their first step toward me and the whispers in the room sharpened into something more expectant, more hungry, I realized that everyone there was no longer witnessing a situation. They were watching a spectacle, and in their eyes I was not a person, not a wife, not even a victim. I was entertainment, something to be removed, something to be talked about later over drinks and laughter. And as I stood there, completely still while two men approached me with the kind of rehearsed politeness that only exists when power is being enforced quietly, I could feel the weight of humiliation pressing against my chest, tightening around my lungs, threatening to turn into something visible, something they could consume, but I refused to give them that, refused to let this moment become the version of me they would remember, because even now, even standing on the edge of being thrown out of a life I had once believed was mine, I understood something none of them did. Something Darius had failed to recognize the moment he chose to erase me in front of this room. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," one of the guards said, his voice careful, respectful in tone but firm in intention. And for a brief second, the entire room leaned forward just slightly, anticipating movement, anticipating compliance, anticipating the moment I would lower my head and follow instructions like someone who had no choice, like someone who had already lost. And I could feel Darius watching me, not directly, but in that calculated way he always did when he expected a certain outcome, when he believed he had already controlled the situation enough to predict how it would end, and that assumption, that quiet certainty, was exactly why he was about to be blindsided in a way he would never recover from. I didn't move immediately, didn't resist, didn't argue. I simply stood there for one more second longer than expected. Long enough to make the guards hesitate just slightly, long enough for the room to notice that something was different, that I was not reacting the way they had already decided I would. And then slowly, I lifted my hand, not toward them, but toward my face, wiping away the tear that had escaped without permission, not with embarrassment, not with shame, but with a kind of calm that did not belong to someone being removed, and that single movement shifted something in the atmosphere, subtle but undeniable. Because people notice when reality doesn't match expectation. And right now, I was no longer fitting into the role they had assigned to me. "It's all right," I said quietly, my voice steady, controlled. And that alone made the guards pause again, because they had expected resistance or collapse, not composure, not acceptance delivered with that level of calm. And I could feel the room reacting to it, the whispers changing tone, curiosity replacing certainty, confusion beginning to take shape where judgment had been. And for the first time since Darius walked into that room holding another woman's hand, I felt the balance shift, not fully, not dramatically, but enough to know that this story was not ending the way they thought it would. I turned my gaze back to him then, really looking at him for the first time since he had spoken those words, since he had declared another woman as his wife in front of everyone. And what I saw was not power, not strength, but someone performing control. Someone standing in a moment he believed he owned without realizing how fragile it actually was. And I wondered, briefly, if he would have done this differently if he had known the truth. If he would have chosen a quieter betrayal. A more discreet exit. Something less public, less final. But then I realized it didn't matter, because his choices had already been made, and their consequences were already in motion. The woman beside him shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around his arm as if she could feel the change even if she didn't understand it. And when she looked at me again, there was something new in her expression, not fear, not yet, but uncertainty, a subtle crack in the confidence she had walked in with, and it almost made me feel something close to pity. Almost, because she had no idea what she had stepped into, no idea that this moment was not a victory, but the beginning of something she was not prepared to survive. "You should go," she said, her voice softer now, less sharp, as if trying to maintain control of a situation she could no longer fully read. And I tilted my head slightly, considering her words, not because I was going to follow them, but because I wanted her to understand something before everything changed. Something that would stay with her long after this night was over. "Do you know who owns this place?" I asked, my tone still calm, still measured. And the question seemed to confuse her more than anything else, her brows drawing together slightly as she glanced at Darius, expecting him to answer, expecting him to dismiss me the way he had been doing all night. And he did, almost immediately, letting out a short, dismissive breath as if the question itself was irrelevant. As if I was reaching for something meaningless to hold on to. And maybe to him, it was meaningless, because he had never needed to question where anything came from, never needed to look beyond what was presented to him. But that was exactly the difference between us. "Enough," he said, his tone sharper now, impatience creeping in as he looked toward the guards again, reinforcing his earlier command without needing to repeat it fully. And I could see the moment he decided to end this, to shut it down before it became something he could not control. But it was already too late for that, already beyond his reach, already moving in a direction he could not stop. I reached into my clutch then, the movement small, unhurried, deliberate, and for a second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath again, because even something as simple as that carried weight now, carried attention, carried a sense that whatever I was about to do mattered in a way they had not expected. And when I pulled out my phone, I didn't raise it dramatically, didn't announce anything. I simply unlocked it and looked down at the screen for a brief moment, as if confirming something. Only, I understood, and then I made a call. It rang once, twice, and then it connected. "Dad," I said softly, my voice no louder than it had been the entire time. But somehow it carried further now, somehow it reached deeper into the room, because of everything that had already happened. Because of everything that was about to happen. "I'm here." That was it. No explicación. No urgency. No emotion beyond the calm that had defined me since the moment I stopped reacting the way they expected me to. And when I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my hand, the silence that followed was different from anything that had come before it. It was no longer about me being removed. It was about something unknown entering the situation. Something that could not be predicted, could not be controlled, and Darius felt it. I could see it in the slight tension in his jaw, in the way his posture shifted just enough to reveal that something about that call had unsettled him, even if he didn't understand why. "Calling your family won't change anything," he said, his voice carrying a hint of irritation now, as if trying to reassert control over a moment that was slipping away from him. And I met his gaze one last time before everything shifted completely, before the doors opened. Before the truth walked into that room in a way no one could ignore, and I simply smiled, not with satisfaction, not with revenge, but with certainty, because for the first time that night, I knew exactly how this was going to end, and more importantly, so would he. The moment the call ended and the faint echo of my own voice seemed to linger in the air longer than it should have, the atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, like the subtle change in pressure before a storm arrives. And as I stood there with nothing but calm in my expression, I could feel every person in that room trying to make sense of something they could not yet see, could not yet understand, because power, when it is real, does not announce itself loudly. It enters quietly and then changes everything without asking for permission. Darius exhaled sharply, the sound carrying more impatience now than confidence. As if the delay itself was an inconvenience to him. As if whatever I had just done was nothing more than an attempt to prolong the inevitable. And he glanced toward the guards again, clearly ready to finalize the moment, to complete the narrative he had started the second he walked into that room holding another woman's hand. But the guards didn't move this time, not immediately, because even they could feel it now, that something had changed. Something had interrupted the natural flow of control, and hesitation, even in small amounts, is enough to disrupt authority when it is not absolute. The woman beside him shifted again, her earlier confidence now replaced by something more cautious, her fingers loosening slightly from his arm as her gaze moved toward the entrance of the ballroom, as if she was expecting something without knowing what it was, and that instinct, that quiet awareness that something bigger was approaching, made her take half a step back. A movement so small most people wouldn't notice, but I did, because I had spent years observing details like that. Understanding how quickly people reposition themselves when they sense instability. "This is getting ridiculous," Darius said, his voice louder now, not to me specifically, but to the room, to the situation, to the moment he felt slipping just slightly beyond his control. And when he laughed this time, it sounded different, sharper, forced, like something he was using to fill a space that no longer belonged to him completely. And I didn't respond, didn't engage, because there was no need to argue with someone who was about to be confronted with a truth that required no explanation. The doors opened. Not dramatically, not with force, but with a quiet precision that drew attention instantly, because timing is everything when power reveals itself. And as every head in that room turned toward the entrance, the energy shifted again, this time unmistakably, as a group of men stepped inside. Their presence alone enough to silence the remaining whispers, because these were not just guests, not just attendees, they were figures people recognized, respected, feared in a way that doesn't need introduction. And behind them, walking at a pace that was neither rushed nor slow, was the man who made everything else in that room feel temporary. My father didn't need to announce himself. He didn't need to raise his voice or demand attention, because attention followed him naturally, because real power does not chase recognition. It commands it simply by existing, and as he walked forward, the space in front of him seemed to open automatically, people stepping aside without being asked, without even realizing they were doing it, because presence like that doesn't negotiate, it moves and others adjust. Darius straightened slightly, his posture instinctively shifting as recognition began to form, because even he knew who this man was, even he had built parts of his success on proximity to people like him, on connections, on appearances, on aligning himself with influence he did not fully understand, and now that influence was walking directly toward the woman he had just tried to remove from the room. I didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't rush toward him, because I didn't need to, because this moment was not about proving anything. It was about revealing what had always been true. And when he finally reached me, he didn't hesitate, didn't question, he simply pulled me into an embrace that was firm, protective, absolute. And in that single gesture, everything changed. "My daughter," he said, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to settle over the entire room like something final, something undeniable, and the silence that followed was complete. Not a whisper, not a movement, not even the sound of someone shifting in place, because realization, when it hits collectively, creates a kind of stillness that nothing else can replicate. I stepped back slightly, meeting his eyes for just a second, and there was no need for explanation between us, no need to describe what had happened or how it had unfolded, because he could see it in the room, in the faces, in the tension, in the man standing frozen a few feet away with everything he believed slipping out of his control in real time. Darius didn't speak immediately because there are moments when confidence has no place to stand, when the version of reality you have been operating in no longer aligns with what is happening in front of you. And this was that moment for him, the exact point where everything began to collapse internally before it showed externally. And when he finally found his voice, it lacked the certainty it had carried all night. "I didn't know," he said, and those 3 words revealed more than anything else he could have said, because they exposed the core of his failure, not just the betrayal, not just the arrogance, but the fact that he had never looked closely enough to understand the woman he stood beside for years, never questioned, never explored, never valued beyond what he could see on the surface. My father's expression didn't change, didn't soften, didn't react emotionally, because this was not a personal moment for him. It was a matter of principle, of control, of correction. And when he turned his attention fully toward Darius, the shift was immediate, the air itself seeming to tighten around them as if the room understood that what was about to be said would redefine everything. "You replaced her," he stated, not as a question, not as an accusation, but as a fact, and Darius couldn't answer, because there was no version of the truth that would serve him now, no explanation that would restore what had already been lost. And the woman who had stood beside him earlier had now taken another step back, her distance growing with every second, her expression no longer confident, no longer composed, but uncertain, unsettled, as if she was finally beginning to understand the scale of what she had stepped into. "This event," my father continued, his voice steady, controlled, "belongs to me." And the words landed with a weight that rippled through the room, because ownership, when spoken like that, changes perception instantly, changes alignment, changes everything. And he didn't stop there, didn't leave space for interpretation, because clarity is most effective when it is complete. "This building," he added, his gaze still fixed on Darius, "is mine." And now the murmurs began again, quieter, more cautious, because people were recalculating in real time, reassessing everything they thought they knew. And Darius stood there, absorbing it piece by piece, the structure of his confidence collapsing layer by layer as reality replaced assumption. "And your company," my father finished, his tone unchanged, "exists because I allowed it to." And that was the moment everything fully shifted, not just in the room, not just in perception, but in identity, because what Darius lost in that second was not just control. It was the belief that he had ever truly possessed it. And as I stood there beside the man who had built the world he thought he owned, I realized that the most devastating part of betrayal is not the act itself. It is the moment. Truth removes every illusion you were hiding behind, and leaves you with nothing but reality, raw, unfiltered, undeniable. The silence that followed my father's final words did not feel empty. It felt heavy, final, like something irreversible had just been written into the reality of every person standing in that ballroom. And as I looked at Darius, I saw a version of him I had never seen before. Not the confident man who walked in holding another woman's hand. Not the controlled figure who believed he dictated the narrative, but someone stripped of certainty, someone standing in the aftermath of his own decisions, with nothing left to hold on to except the truth he had spent years ignoring. And the most striking part was not the shock on his face, but the absence of anything else. No defense, no anger, no immediate denial, just the quiet, suffocating realization that everything he thought he owned had never truly been his. The woman who had stood beside him, who had smiled with that effortless confidence when she first entered the room, had now completely stepped away, her body angled slightly toward the exit as if preparing for escape, because instinctively she understood what many in that room were only beginning to process, that proximity to power is meaningless when that power is no longer stable. And in that moment, Darius was no longer a source of security, he was a risk, and people like her do not stay where risk outweighs benefit. My father did not raise his voice, did not extend the moment unnecessarily, because real authority does not linger for effect. It acts, it concludes, it moves forward. And when he turned slightly toward me, placing a hand lightly on my shoulder, the gesture was not just personal, it was symbolic, a quiet but undeniable declaration of alignment, of position, of truth. And then he spoke again. Not to Darius this time, but to the room, his voice steady, controlled, carrying across the silence with effortless clarity as he informed them that there would be immediate changes, that operations tied to certain individuals would be reviewed, that decisions made under false authority would be corrected. And as he spoke, I could feel the shift happening in real time, not just emotionally, but structurally, because people were already adjusting, already distancing themselves from Darius, already recalibrating their understanding of who held the real power in that room. Darius finally moved then, just slightly, as if the weight of everything had become too much to stand still under. And when he spoke, his voice lacked the sharpness it had carried earlier, replaced instead by something strained, something uncertain, as he tried to explain, tried to frame what had happened in a way that might preserve even a fragment of his position. But there are moments when explanation becomes irrelevant, when the truth is too clear to be reshaped. And this was one of those moments. "I didn't know," he repeated, as if the words might carry more weight the second time, as if ignorance could somehow soften the consequences of his actions. And for a brief second, I felt something stir inside me, not sympathy, not forgiveness, but recognition of the man he used to be. The man who once stood beside me without needing to prove anything, without needing to dominate or control. And that was the part that hurt, not what he had done tonight, but how far he had moved, away from who he had been. I stepped forward then, closing the distance between us for the first time since everything had been revealed. And the room seemed to tighten again, attention sharpening as people leaned in just slightly, because even now, even after everything, they were waiting for something, a final word, a defining moment, something that would close this chapter in a way they could understand. And I looked at him, not with anger, not with hatred, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "You didn't need to know," I said quietly, my voice steady, calm, carrying just enough to reach him and no one else. And he frowned slightly, confusion flickering again as if he was still trying to find a version of reality where this could be undone, where this could be explained away, where this could be fixed. But I didn't give him that space, didn't allow him to build another illusion on top of the one that had just been destroyed. "You needed to respect what you never tried to understand," I continued. And those words landed differently, not as an attack, but as a truth he could not argue with, because respect does not require knowledge. It requires intention. And he had chosen repeatedly not to see me, not to value me, not to question anything beyond what benefited him. And that choice had led him here. His shoulders dropped slightly, the last visible sign of resistance fading as acceptance began to take its place. Not fully, not comfortably, but enough to show that he understood, finally, that there was no version of this where he walked away unchanged. And for a moment, the noise of the room returned in fragments, quiet murmurs, shifting movements, the subtle sounds of people repositioning themselves within a new reality, because the structure they had believed in minutes ago no longer existed in the same way. And they were adjusting to it in real time. I stepped back then, creating space again, not because I needed distance, but because this moment no longer belonged to him. It belonged to me, to what came next, to the future that had just been cleared of everything that no longer aligned with it. And when I turned away, I did not hesitate, did not look back immediately, because power is not proven through reaction. It is proven through direction. And my direction was forward. The crowd parted instinctively as I began to walk. The same people who had watched me be humiliated now stepping aside without question. Their expressions changed, their perception shifted, because they were no longer looking at me as someone being removed. They were looking at me as someone who had always belonged at the center of everything they valued. And that shift, more than anything else, was the true end of the night. I could feel my father beside me, not leading, not pulling, simply present. And that presence alone was enough to reinforce what had just been revealed. Enough to ensure that nothing that happened in that room would be questioned later, because truth, when it is backed by undeniable power, does not require defense. As we reached the doors, I allowed myself one final glance back, just one, and what I saw was exactly what I expected. Darius standing where I had left him, no longer surrounded by admiration, no longer positioned at the center, but isolated in a space that had already begun to move on without him. And in that image, I understood something with complete clarity. That loss is not always immediate. Sometimes it unfolds slowly, in the silence that follows, in the absence of what once existed, in the realization that what you thought was yours was never truly within your control. The doors closed behind me with a soft finality, and as I stepped out into the night, the air felt different. Lighter, clearer, as if the world itself had shifted slightly to align with the truth that had just been restored. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely aligned with myself, not hidden, not reduced, not defined by someone else's perception, but fully present in my own reality. And if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been dismissed in a space you helped build, if you've ever been made to feel invisible by someone who only appeared powerful because you allowed them to stand where you placed them, then understand this. Silence is not weakness, patience is not passivity, and the moment you choose to stand in your truth, everything that was built on illusion will begin to fall, not loudly, not chaotically, but completely. So if this story made you feel something, if you understand the power behind it, make sure you like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. When the truth finally stands in front of you, would you reveal it? Or would you let them lose everything without ever knowing why?